Welcome to another episode of the Vinimark Podcast. I want to apologize in advance for some loss in audio quality during the first few minutes of this episode. There are moments where a few of Samantha's comments are lost due to poor recording quality, but the effect is temporary and her content is dynamite. So thanks in advance for sticking with us and pushing through the discomfort. Now today we're picking up the conversation where the Vinimark webinar left off, discussing gender equality, diversity in wine, and the path forward for men and women working in the wine industry. In the first half of this discussion, I'm privileged to be chatting with Samantha O'Keefe, who is an award-winning mother and protector of two boys, but who also owns Lismore Wine Estate in Greyton, where she makes wine that garner international acclaim. Samantha, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us. I hear you're very busy with two construction projects right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Thanks, Jono, for having me. On the 17th of December last year, a bushfire, the wind turned, and basically all the infrastructure on Lismore, including my home and my wine cellar, and 40% of my vineyards was burned to the ground. And with the help of a lot of friends and strangers around the world in the South African wine industry, I have started rebuilding. And so I have a cellar being rebuilt. The insurance company is rebuilding the home, and then I'm planting 6-hectare vineyards. So it's a very busy time right
Well, and what in particular are you planting?
Planted the Syrah vineyards were the ones that were the most damaged, and so I'm planting a lot of Syrah, hoping to just get some in line so that in the next 5 to 6 years, those vineyards will start maturing. I'm planting more Chardonnay, and then one of the new blocks of Viognier that I planted in 2016 was burned to the ground, so I'm replanting.
And I remember when the event happened, there was a sort of groundswell of support, but I guess the reality is that it's not a quick fix, right? There's going to be years of real struggle to kind of climb back to where you were. Have you felt like you've experienced sustained support, or is it really tough right now?
Well, I think when you lose everything, it's going to be very tough. But I definitely still feel the support of the South African wine industry. I mean, it never ends, and they reach out to me. Various individuals and organizations reach out to me all the time. I definitely know that they have my back, and everybody is just walking with me as I go through this. I have no doubt that Lismore will be rebuilt and that everything will eventually be okay. It's just a lot of work for all of us to get there.
Well, as a consumer that considers it a challenge to try and find any Lismore bottles I can on local shelves, I am rooting for the success of the project. And I'm very excited for the vintages that are coming out that you've made with other people's fruit. I think that's immensely exciting.
In a time of much despair, it was really fun to have all of this fruit from Pop Vineyards coming in and distracting me to be able to put my creativity and all of my love into that fruit to make some really nice wines. Watch that space. There's some really, really thrilling wines coming out of it.
Amazing. Okay, so to the topic at hand, I know that in all of our previous chats around the treatment of women in wine, I've got the sense from you in the past that I know that the cause of equality for women in wine is enormously important to you, but I also know that you are skeptical sometimes about the efficacy of trying to talk about it. Would you say this is an accurate assessment?
I think so. I think it's a very complicated topic.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what makes it complicated for you?
It's a touchy subject. I think when people hear the topic, especially men, of women in wine, the assumption is that the conversation is about how to position yourself to get a job as a head winemaker or how to effectively ask for a raise or promotion. And yet, being a woman in any industry comes with its own perils and pitfalls, and obvious ones of sexual harassment, and in extreme situations, sexual assault. Um, Coming up against prejudices and assumptions that men have about women, and I just don't think it's an easy topic. I think it's fraught with perils that you're going to trigger, especially men. But even maybe you're trying to have a conversation about how to position yourself for a good job, but then a woman will bring up the fact that she is sexually harassed, and you just go down a rabbit hole. It's very complicated.
I guess essentially it feels like you're saying the conversations are usually started in a kind of semi-political arena, but the reality is that the topic involves huge amounts of personal trauma.
The one thing that I think it's important to remember is that when you meet a woman who's in the wine industry, but particularly winemakers, it's a young woman who made a choice to go to university and to go into the agriculture department. In a world of choices, this young woman understood that she'd be going into a largely male environment. And so I think that we as women, we very clearly understand that we're supposed to just put our chin up and shut up.
So, how do we begin to change that then? Because, as we've mentioned earlier, there's a broad spectrum of areas that need to be addressed. Seemingly, even the most trivial of them are still really important, like equal treatment in the workplace. But at the deepest, darkest points of this conversation, there is massive human trauma that, for whatever reason, because of the political label that's put on it, is not allowed to be talked about. How do we begin to break that?
I don't know. And I really don't. If you look at what happened with the Me Too movement, there was a lot of catharsis, and women started speaking up of stories big and small. But one of the unintended consequences of that is that some men out there in the world questioned, well, and what am I supposed to do? Do I just stop hiring women? Because I don't want to be in a situation where I'm accidentally stepping into a space where I shouldn't be. And we certainly don't want that. None of us want that. You know, it creates a world of peril. And the truth is, if I'm advising a young woman, I must advise her. It's my responsibility to advise her that you need to kind of keep stuff to yourself. You need to suck it up and take it. Ultimately, with grace and with power, get yourself out of a situation. But at the same time, be very careful, because in the end, you are expendable as a young person, let alone a young woman. And so it's complicated, Jono. I just think that's why I am skeptical about these kind of conversations. We can have them privately, but to have these forums where we're going to find answers, we're not going to find answers. I'm in situations every day where men are saying really stupid stuff, and they don't even realize it. They have no idea what their language, what their locker room humor, what it does. I was in a room a couple of days ago, mostly men. There were two women in the room, me being one of them, and one of the older guys made some locker room joke, ha ha ha. And what are we supposed to do? We just sit there and go ha ha ha, when it was actually stupid. The world can spin without that kind of language.
What I think gave me hope in the webinar was listening to you talk about being a mother, talking about how women raise men. And in some senses, people chuckle along to the locker room jokes, but imagine a generation of men being raised who already know that that is inappropriate. How have you approached raising your sons? And can you give us moments of success where you've managed to instill in them the attitude that ultimately will build a more coherent whole society?
Well, I mean, obviously, my sons have been raised by a single mom and a single woman who is a farmer in the middle of nowhere, and a business owner and a winemaker, and they've watched me do everything a man can do and better, I think, sometimes. So setting an example is the first way of going. They've attended, co-ed schools their entire life, and so they've competed with girls. My both of my sons go to a school where last year the top Cambridge math score in the world was a young woman from their school. And those kind of examples, both above them in their mother's generation and beside them in their own generation, show them that anything boys can do, girls can do as well. And so I think that's the base point. But I think I've led by example. I surround myself with strong, powerful women. They've spent their whole life surrounded by those women, and generally men who understand powerful women as well. And I think when they've ever been in a situation where they've seen their mother be spoken down to, they almost like hold their breath because they're afraid of what I might.
That's amazing. It's good to fear a woman scorned.
Yeah.
And to touch on this, I mean, there are countless studies that show that the family unit is this sort of primary responsibility, or at least bears the primary responsibility for not just educating the next generation, but also placing them into society and instilling values in them. And so to listen to you talking about the responsibility to the next generation was one of the few times where I felt like, well, there is hope in that answer. I, I would like to think that that principle of familial education and instilling of values can happen in the workplace too. Do you think there's hope for that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's, it's cultural, right? All of our attitudes about men and women and the dynamics in our society is cultural. And, for a generation to grow up with different role models, of course it changes the way that they see the world. In these last couple of days, the United States of America now has a female vice president. And I'm going to cry when I say that. It was so powerful for me to see. I sobbed listening to her speak, to know that we can grow up to be doctors, lawyers, and winemakers, but we couldn't grow up to be president or vice president. But now we can. And role models are important, and they're important for little girls, but they're also important for little boys. And any young man now knows that his president could be a woman. That changes the way you view the world in a big way.
And that touches on what we spoke about in previous chats about, in some senses, equality not being a goal big enough, in the sense that recognizing that there are areas where women must lead society. And perhaps there are areas where men will lead, but that's not the point right now. The point is that there are qualities and strengths that women have that men just don't have. And to see that celebrated as being far beyond equality is something that I think has to be a part of the conversation.
Well, that's it. I don't like the word equality, and I don't think we're fighting for equality. I think when I was a young woman, when I was 15, 16, maybe 20 years old, I thought it was about equality. But when I became a mother, I realized we'll never be equal. Daddies cannot be mommies, and vice versa. And we as women bring different strengths to the world. We bring empathy, and we multitask, and we I think women have more humor in everything that they approach. It's just we are different. We're never going to be equal. And we as women, no matter how many times a father does the dishes or picks up the kids from school, he will never be able to be a mother. And so, no matter who you are, whether you're the vice president of the United States, a winemaker, or a banker, you're always going to have to balance being a mom and your job. And no man will ever be able to truly understand that juggling act the way that another woman would.
So in this problem that we are trying to talk our way out of, are you of the opinion that this is a problem that women need to solve for themselves? Or do you feel like you still have hope for allies in the male camp? Can men bring anything to this solution?
Of course they can. I don't think it's entirely their problem to solve, though. I think that ultimately we as women have to share information and support each other, but not in some nominal symposium. I think it's much deeper than that. I think one of the things that we do, we're so busy and caught up in our own lives that we almost don't have support groups where we share how hard it is to be attempting to make world class wine and not forget the swimming trunks and make sure that the books are wrapped, and you're trying to survive harvest and you haven't spent any time with your husband and he's bitter, you know, things like that. These are real issues that women juggle that men just can't relate to. And I think the more that we just help each other and say that's normal. I feel the same way. My kids also didn't have their books wrapped on time and they got in trouble. I mean, it's silly things like that, but it's something we need to hear, is that I'm not the only one. I'm not failing at this. It's hard to balance these competing demands.
And you were talking about, you feel like in many senses it's a woman's responsibility to be sharing information and communicating. What is your advice to sincere fathers who are trying to emulate your example, who are trying to raise A, young men who know how to treat women, but B, women who know how to grow into their full strength? What are some of the common blind spots that you witness in well meaning fathers trying to train their sons to be better?
I think a common one is on both situations is that, let's say the son treats the mother badly. The father may do the right thing and step in and scold the son, don't speak to your mother that way. But it's also the mother's responsibility to turn around and say, look, you never talk to me that way again. You don't treat me that way. I think both the father has to say this is, as a man, what we don't do, but the woman starts with her son by saying, you treat me with respect, you don't talk to me that way. And I see sometimes in families that even if the dad speaks up for the mother, she doesn't stick up for herself, if that makes sense. I think, it obviously is about role modeling.
Well, that's exactly it, is that so many, and whether this is professional aspirations or personal interactions, we are so defined by the examples that we see. And I think that is one of the almost these cycles of self-defeating behaviors, that talking about it is often discouraged. So there are fewer examples of people speaking out. So there are fewer examples of young people living in this new pattern. And, and it just feels like trying to break that pattern can be so exhausting. And now I consider you to be a genuine pioneer in this movement towards a kind of a society full of empowered, secure women. But I also feel like being on the vanguard of that movement can be pretty tiring and even lonely. Do you feel like uh, you are finding victory in this area, or is it quite frankly quite discouraging?
I definitely don't feel discouraged. I think I would like to just see more women in the room. I ultimately, it shouldn't have to be one or two women in a room of 50 men trying to change their attitudes. If that room is 25% women, let alone 25 women of 50, those men will behave differently. It's as simple as that. I come up against it all the time. I mean, I'm often the only woman in the room or one of two. Um, and and men don't really know how to behave. They're not sure if they should stand up when I walk in, if they should pull out my chair, if they should ignore me.
No, so what are the rules? I mean, is pulling out a chair seen as patronizing, or is that seen as gentlemanly?
See, that's the rabbit hole that you start to go down. That's its own conversation. I've had really interesting debates about this, and I don't know. I don't know the answer one way or another. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today. But it's exactly that kind of thing where this is a very broad, complicated conversation, and yeah, I mean, you started this conversation with me at saying, why are you so skeptical of trying to fix everything in 30-minute podcasts? Well, this is why, because you, you can do 3 hours on, is it patronizing or respectful? you know? Yeah.
Okay, so we're not allowed to talk about chivalry. Okay, but
Yeah. And I think every woman would have a different answer.
and when we started, you were talking a little bit about how, and even you just said it now, these forums are often not the place where you can deal with the most pressing issues, whether it is sexual abuse, deep traumas. So, and that's understood. Perhaps these sort of podcasts are not the forums where we can make progress in these areas. But if you were to think big and just try and envision a space where that can happen, what would that look like? What might be better ways to facilitate A, consciousness in men, but B, real spaces where these traumas can be dealt with?
I think it has to start in private groups with women, to be honest. A loud forum with women and men, usually just you find defensive men, like I said, who are triggered. I mean, this whole thing of like white male privilege is so real, and I don't think we have time for it. So, but I think that us just hearing each other, one of the things I think that is a common womanhood thing is that we all feel we're the only one. We don't talk about a lot of this stuff. And when you start to talk to each other, you realize you're not the only one, and everybody has, tips on how they handled it, or what should I do in this situation. Um, but that assumes, again, we're in a room where women are few. I think the easiest solution to all of this is just making sure we have more women in the room and that we take up a lot of space in the room. And men just generally don't tread on women who take up space. And whether it's one woman with her chest puffed out, or because the room is now half women, you know. The very few transgressions happen in a room where 50% of the people are women.
But what you're hinting at there, which I think is worth saying explicitly, is that there is a lot of behavior that men already know is inappropriate. Just by the fact that you assert that when the room is 50% women, all those jokes disappear, or I assume, sort of locker room banter, it means that there is already a realization of what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And I guess it's a shame that still pops up when the women are absent. And I suppose that's what we're aiming towards, right? Is a society where even if there is only one woman in the room, there is enough social momentum in that room to stop the sort of behavior that belittles that woman.
Well, I don't think my son's generation have that knee-jerk instinct. I mean, sometimes with older men, I think it's like Tourette syndrome. It's like a tick. They don't even know how to stop it, and it almost comes out with this clumsy. They're trying to relate by saying something stupid, and some women would be hurt, some women might be angry. I just sort of shake my head and say,
But what would happen if in that situation you said, "Oh, Steve, you really should know better. We live in a new age." I mean, if you were to make a comment like, what would happen in your mind?
No, I mean, we do live in 2020, so I am able sometimes to say, you do realize that was wildly inappropriate. I mean, come on. You know? I mean, but this isn't 1950. You do know that what you said was wildly inappropriate right there. But see, that could make me unwelcome at the next meeting. So that's what I'm saying. There aren't easy answers. It's a very complicated subject, and lots of as I said, we could do a podcast on chivalry alone.
Well, I feel like while we may not find any answers today, I definitely feel like I've been shifted along the spectrum just by listening to you talk. So I really, really appreciate you giving your time today. I feel like to the industry at large in South Africa, your contribution is incredibly important, and your example is an inspiration. Yeah, my hope is that what you've said today will actually be the start of 1,000 conversations in not only just in boardrooms or wine cellars, but also across family tables. And I think that's where we're going to see important, powerful change. So thank you.
Yeah, a funny story that I want to end with is I took my two teenage boys to a winemakers event, and the room was full of lots of famous winemakers, and obviously it was lots of men, but everybody had their families there, wives and children as well. And there was one man that I knew his face, but I couldn't place him. I didn't know who he was, and he was chatting to my teenage boys. So when they were done, I said to them, I'm not quite sure who he was. And they said, well, maybe he's someone's husband. And I said, what? And they said, maybe he's a winemaker's husband. And I laughed and I said, no, not in that room. He wasn't anyone's husband. I just thought that was a very funny, my kid's perspective is that, the men in the room are as likely to be some successful person's husband as they are to be the successful person.
Well, exactly. And I think this last year we've come to use the term new normal as a negative. But how amazing to hear that to your sons, that is the new normal. It's completely logical that should be a successful winemaker's husband. Well, thanks for sharing that. And best of luck with the construction and the time ahead. We look forward to following your story and hearing more about it.
Thank you very much, Jono.
We've reached the end of part one of the discussion titled The Role of Women in South African Wine, The Path to Equality and Beyond. This recording is part of the Vinimark Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join me for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.